Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Caryl Churchill's play, Light Shining in Buckinghamshire. This is a history play, and if you know me, if you followed my channel for a while, you may know that I love history plays. This one is set during the English Civil War, which is one of my favorite historical time periods. I think it's an absolutely fascinating time, in part because of the very thing that Churchill is exploring in this play, which is that there was a ton of just crazy theological and political experimentation and these new ideas, and people were trying to figure out what it would mean to have an egalitarian society, or what kind of social order needs to be maintained to have a society continue functioning. What does it mean to sin? What are humanity's ethical obligations in a time when a lot of people in England and in Europe more broadly thought that Jesus was about to return and start the end of the world, the biblical apocalypse. So the play's big themes are sort of exploring this religious tension and the political tensions that go along with it, along with these questions about poverty, access to resources, and gender roles, which were central to both the experience of people during the English Civil War, but also central to the 1970s, when this play was created. It premiered in September of '76. So one thing I want to start, actually, because Churchill has this note on production here, at least published in this issue, the Methuen Churchill Plays 1 collection. This play was written through a sort of collective workshop process. She says here, there was then a 3-week workshop with the actors in which, through talk, reading, games, and improvisation, we tried to get closer to the issues and the people. So even though that workshop didn't produce the script as such, Churchill still wrote the play. A lot of the material that was generated in that workshop was incorporated into the play. So that's really significant in terms of the way that this play was created. Because, again, as we'll see in a little bit, collectivism and how we work together ethically to build a better society is really at the heart of this play. These are central questions that the characters are grappling with. The other thing, sort of meta-theatrically, that I think is interesting here is that the play draws on several different texts from the time, and one that's later. So there's a list here of documentary material. We have a section from Isaiah. We have a section from the writings of Ebenezer Cope, who was a leveler. We have Walt Whitman. We have the Putney debates. We have Gerard Winstanley's The True Leveler's Standard Advanced. I'll talk more about Winstanley because we have The English Soldier's Standard to Repair To, which was a pamphlet put out in 1649. We have excerpts from The Moderate, which was a leveler newspaper, and we have a passage from Ecclesiastes, all of which get incorporated into the play. So, as with the communal workshop creation process, textually, this play is a sort of communally created document because it draws on historical texts, biblical texts, poetic texts, etc., to do the work of the play. So, it's worth having a little bit of background on the political and theological debates of the English Civil War in order to understand light shining in Buckinghamshire. So you had a number of different factions in the English Civil War. On a sort of cursory level, people often reduce this to the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The Cavaliers being the Royalists who supported Charles I, and after his execution, Charles II. Typically Anglican, typically aristocratic, and from certain portions of England, especially southern England, the home counties area, those tended to be areas with strong royalist sentiment, I think. Then you had the Roundheads, which were the parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell, more likely to be religious dissidents, so not Church of England necessarily, but maybe Puritans, maybe some reform-minded Anglicans, some other religious minorities, not Catholics typically. They also tended to, although there were a lot of aristocratic officers in the parliamentarian army, they tended to draw support from the middle classes, what we would now maybe call the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, the emerging merchant class, craftspeople, traders, things like this. That's an overly simplistic division, and really light shining in Buckinghamshire is only interested in the parliamentarian side and the divisions within the parliamentarian side. So one group that you've got that Churchill seems not to have that much sympathy for, and quite frankly, if I'm honest, I don't have that much sympathy for, is the sort of the military establishment or the parliamentarian establishment. Oliver Cromwell, Ireton, what's his first name? Oh, he's just listed here as General Ireton. But these sort of official figures from the military or parliamentary establishment, they initially recruit people with these sort of promises of freedom and righteousness, etc., etc. So Starr, for instance, gives us this speech fairly early in the play, trying to recruit people into the parliamentary army. So he says here, "Life is hard, brothers, and how will it get better? I tell you, life in Babylon is hard, and Babylon must be destroyed. In Babylon you are slaves. Babylon is the kingdom of Antichrist, the kingdom of popery, the kingdom of the king, and it must be destroyed, because then will come the kingdom of Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem you will be free. That is why you will join as soldiers, to destroy Antichrist, to fight with Parliament for Jerusalem, to fight with Christ's saints for Christ's kingdom, because when Parliament has defeated Antichrist, and then Christ will come. Christ will come in person, God and man, and will rule over England for 1,000 years, and the saints will reign with him. And who are the saints? You are, the poor people of this country. When Christ came, did he come to the rich? No, he came to the poor. He's coming to you again. If you prepare for him by defeating Antichrist, which is the royalists, if you join in the army now, you will be one of the saints. You will rule with Jesus 1,000 years. We have just had another bad harvest, but it is written, when Jesus comes, the floors shall be full of wheat and the vats overflow with wine. Why did Jesus Christ purchase the earth with his blood? He purchased it for the saints, for you. It will all be yours. You're poor now, you're despised now, but the gentlemen who look down on you will soon find out the inhabitants of Jerusalem are Commonwealth men. Now is the moment. It will be too late when Christ comes to say you want to be saved. Some will be cast into the pit, into the burning lake, into the unquenchable fire, and some will be clothed in white linen and ride white horses and rule with King Jesus in Jerusalem, shining with jasper and chrysolite. So give now, give what you can to Christ now to pay his soldiers. Christ will pay you back in diamonds. Join now for a soldier of Christ, and you will march out of this town to Jerusalem. Who are you? What are you? I know you all, and you know me. You are nobody here. You have nothing. But the moment you join the army, you will have everything. You will be as important as anybody in England. You will be Christ's saints. So this is the promise, the liberatory ambition of the parliamentary army. It is both a political vision and a theological vision. But, and especially in the second half of the play, this becomes a very common refrain that people make. The parliamentary army never delivered these liberatory promises. In many ways, the government that was installed after the fall of Charles I was not all that different. Cromwell especially became almost a monarch, and in some ways his reign was more oppressive for many people than had been Charles I's attempt at absolute monarchy. I'm not a fan of Cromwell. That's worth keeping in mind. My impression of Cromwell, and this is perhaps uncharitable, is that he's kind of the 17th century English equivalent of Stalin, in that I feel that he largely betrays the revolutionary ideals for which he fought in favor of establishing brutal totalitarian rule. But that's Cromwell. We'll leave Cromwell. Except to say that in the section of the Putney debates that Churchill uses in this play, Cromwell does that insidious thing where so the Putney debates, just to give a little bit of background, basically was a debate between the levelers, who were represented both by army officers like Thomas Rainsborough, as well as elected representatives of the common soldiers, versus the leadership of the army, speaking on behalf of Parliament. And the levelers, I'll talk more about the levelers in just a little bit, presented sets of demands for egalitarian and communal society, basically to build the freedom and equality that they had been promised in England in exchange for serving in the army. And Cromwell and Ireton and the leaders of the official party, basically the military establishment, largely rejected the egalitarian measures proposed by the levelers. So the excerpts that we get from the Putney debates in this play include those things. And Cromwell does that insidious thing that politicians often do, where he presents himself as sympathetic to and desiring the kinds of egalitarian reforms that the levelers propose, but for pragmatic reasons, they're not going to happen. So we've got all of that stuff in terms of the sort of political issues going on here. A lot of what we get is hope and ambition and liberatory ethos in the opening portion of the play and disillusionment in the latter portion of the play. We also have a lot going on with religious dissenters or alternative perspectives, alternative sects, and things like this. And this is one of the things I find most fascinating about the English Civil War period, is there was just this explosion of different religious ideas. So we've got Anglicans, largely royalists. We've got the Puritans, somewhat more associated with people like Cromwell. They tend to be very hierarchical. They tend to be very exclusionary. They tend to have very definite Calvinistic ideas about religion and what should and should not be tolerated. So that lends itself in a way to that sort of authoritarian personality type that you get with Cromwell. Then you've got these dissenters of different kinds. And the play largely takes us through three different groups. We've got the Levelers, who are both political and religious in their ideology. The Levelers essentially believed in leveling out the social hierarchy. So, not a complete abandonment of things like private property rights or things like this, but the Levelers make the case, for instance, for universal male suffrage. Every man in England, and this is the 17th century, so it is men, every man in England should have the vote, not just property owners. And Cromwell and Ireton basically nixed that. But that's the Leveler position, essentially. And this is founded in a sense of political rights coming out of Enlightenment values. This is founded in religious ideology, believing that every person, or at least every man, is equal before God and therefore should have the right to consent to the government under which he lives. So we've got the Levelers. We get the Diggers, who I actually think are one of the most fascinating groups ever. The Diggers were Christian communists, inspired by the theology of Gerard Winstanley, my favorite Christian theologian. Winstanley largely builds his ideas on the basis that God has given the earth to all of humanity as our commonwealth. It belongs to everyone. Everyone has a share in it. Everyone by virtue of God's divine plan, has the right to live from the earth, but no one has the right to own the earth or to divide it for ownership. So this is essentially the philosophy of the Diggers. And in 1649, a group of diggers went to St. George's Hill in Surrey and basically set up a commune. They owned all of their tools collectively. They owned the seeds collectively. They plowed and planted collectively. The plan was to share the crops and basically to live in common. So the Diggers advocated a complete abandonment of private property, which is not quite the same as personal property necessarily. Basically, personal property is the stuff we tend to, like, when people make the anti-communist argument, they tend to be like, oh, you won't get to own your toothbrush or your car or your jacket or whatever it is. That's all personal property. Private property refers to the tools through which the means of production are organized. So the fact that they owned farming implements communally, they owned the seeds communally, they existed on the land communally, this was essentially an abolition of private property. The diggers were attacked repeatedly by hired thugs, hired by landlords or the wealthy. They were attacked by soldiers of Cromwell's New Model Army. And basically the digger experiment was crushed because they threatened the social order in a way that was intolerable to the powerful people who continued to run England even after the king was executed. So you've got the diggers in here, and we have the destruction of the digger experiment in this play. And then the play ends with the Ranters, who are another really fascinating sect. Basically, they believed that God is everywhere in creation, including within each of us, and therefore, because each of us is God, none of us can sin. There's no such thing as sin. It simply is inconsistent with the nature of our godliness. And so the diggers were this sort of anarchic, hedonistic, creative sect that basically embraced the eat, drink, have sex, and be merry philosophy. So in stark contrast to this ethos, this puritanical ethos of self-discipline and renouncing sex, renouncing excessive consumption or alcohol, etc., etc., the diggers embraced all of those things. They said, I am God, and if God wants to get drunk, to have sex, to eat a big meal, then that's not a sin to do it. So that the Ranters end up being a big component of the last portion of the play. It's also noteworthy that both the diggers and the Ranters had a remarkable degree of gender equality, which was very, very unusual. And gender is a much bigger issue in this play than I've necessarily talked about. It's really central. I mean, it's a Caryl Churchill play, and Churchill is a dedicated feminist. But there are characters here, particularly... let me find Hoskins. We don't get a first name for her, but Hoskins. There's a section where Hoskins is in a church. The preacher is giving his sermon or whatever it is, and Hoskins is sort of responding. The preacher is talking about how some people are going to be damned to hell and only God's elect will be saved. And Hoskins is basically saying, no, that's wrong. God will save everyone because God is infinitely just and merciful. Hoskins is thrown out of the church and beaten up by the congregants. But in the scenes with the Ranters, Hoskins finds a place where she's allowed to express her theology and no one questions or challenges it. So you have that liberatory element as well of sort of freedom of expression for women under these egalitarian and communally oriented religious sects like the Ranters, the Diggers, and actually the Quakers as well, because the Quakers during this period, and they don't really show up here, but the Quakers advocated female education in a time when no one else in England really was advocating that. So this is what the play is about. They sort of liberatory possibilities, and in some ways the bitter defeats that they faced at the hands of the powerful.